Let's start with a question that has been thrown around a good portion of the Mavericks community for a while. Was Mavericks a scam? G'day, Rockhound here. So there's one last Mavericks Proving Grounds video for me to complete, and you're definitely going to hear the answer to whether Mavericks was a scam or not later in the video, during my exclusive interview with Automaton's former CEO, James Thompson. Now this is a very long video, and I understand that many of you won't want to sit right through an hour-long audio interview, plus a lot of additional info from my other sources. So for those people who want the too long didn't listen version, I suggest you check out the list of timestamps that I've placed in the video description below so that you can jump to my summary of why I think Mavericks failed towards the end of the video, or to any particular part of the interview that you're interested in. If you've clicked on this video in the hope of finding out about whether you can get a refund on your Mavericks Founders Pack, then stick with me for just a moment and I'll give you the info you need to hopefully get most of your money back. Since Automaton posted on their website that they had gone into financial administration and the development of Mavericks was ceasing, I contacted James Thompson and he agreed to an interview, which you'll hear shortly. In addition, I've been in touch with a couple of other members of the development team who will remain anonymous, but they provided significant additional insight into what happened, and I'll sum up what those people said after the interview with James. I've also uncovered some additional public information about Automaton's financial situation to help put things into perspective. The other players in all of this are, of course, the players. Clearly a massive disappointment for the Mavericks community that development of the game stopped. Plus founders spent around $30 each on their packs. However, I'm pleased to say that Xsolla does appear to be currently issuing partial refunds to founders, and some of the community have mentioned on the Mavericks Discord that the refund is around $27 or around 90% of the original amount spent. To claim a refund, you should go to the Xsolla website and submit a ticket for the refund using your original transaction ID and the email address you purchased your Founders Pack with. If the refund takes longer than expected, it sounds like some people have been able to speed things up by chatting with Xsolla customer service directly via their website. I hope that helps you if you want a refund. Anyhow, let's listen to what James Thompson has to say about why Mavericks ceased development, what's happening with the developers, and who owns the intellectual property for the Mavericks game. Again, if you want to skip to my summary, check out the timestamps in the video description below. G'day James, thanks for offering to answer some questions about what happened with Mavericks and Automaton. Let's start with a question that has been thrown around a good portion of the Mavericks community for a while. Was Mavericks a scam?
No, definitely not. I know that's the question that gets asked a lot of kind of, early access games or games which are, kind of doing founders programs, but absolutely not. The vast majority of the funding for Mavericks came from Automaton, from myself. It was a project which was very ambitious, and we did also get some support from the community. But at the end of the day, everything was invested in, and it was all for development time. While we haven't seen the project through, on the timelines we were aiming for, and we've now kind of halted development at the moment. Fundamentally, the project was one where a lot of work was done. A lot has been learned from it, and lessons from that will be brought forward. So, despite the fact that we've stopped the development, it was in no way an exercise to scam anyone for people who were kind of early backers of the project.
And so just to clarify around that, the money that founders did put towards the game, what has happened to that money?
It was a portion of a much larger amount of money that was invested in the game. And so all of that money was invested in mostly staff costs. I mean, that's what goes into developing a game. It's the time of all the employees working on the game. Of course, there are some other obligations when you're running the service from hosting to supporting the team in various ways, but offices and other things. But fundamentally, it was all on work going into the game, and because the founders packs, we didn't really go with anything very aggressive. We wanted something to help kick off what was going to be the kind of beta and early releases of the game, to help us in scale a bit faster, and we weren't very aggressive. We charged I believe about $30 for a single pack. It wasn't like a kind of there were games such as Star Citizen and others who are very large programs, which cost huge amounts of money, and have raised huge amounts of money. This was something much smaller scale. I believe the total amount was raised through the founders program was of the order of a couple $100,000, whereas the amount of invested capital was more than 10 times that. So it was something where it was meaningful, and we really appreciate the support, but it was kind of just it was a piece of our dev budget, and I believe that of course some of it will be repayable in some instances. Of course, I can't really speak to the details of that because it is a complicated process whereby the business has stopped the project, and some refunds may be eligible in certain cases, but it is quite complicated because of the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as far as I'm aware, looking at the Mavericks Discord, Xsola currently appear to be paying some partial refunds. Do you know where that's money's coming from, and can you give us a bit more info about that?
Yeah, so there will be an amount of money that was never paid in, which I imagine is what they partially will be using in any refunds that are due. There will also be a claim potentially for the rest of it, but of course, because that was only one out of many things invested into the game, it forms part of the whole kind of administration process of the entity. So there will be some amount there, but the exact number, the exact portion, and whether someone's eligible is going to be somewhat complex. I mean, fundamentally, it was a founders program to back development of the game, right? So, while I really appreciate that, we weren't able to deliver the game in the timeline we described. It was a founder's purchase, and so it's not necessarily true that a refund is eligible for it. But of course, if there is the possibility of it, we'll do what we can to help enable that. And I know in some cases that's meant partial refunds, but there are obviously other obligations beyond the founder's purchases within that business. On top of that, we do have future projects going on, and again, like everyone who's worked on Mavericks, myself, we all want to honor all of that investment. We've learned a lot from it, and we'll be investing that experience, and even potentially some of the results of Mavericks itself in future. So we absolutely appreciate all the founders, and to any extent that we can deliver to that community, we will. But unfortunately, I can't yet say exactly what that's going to be and when. We have to work within the fact that there are changes in projects going on, that it's possible that Mavericks continues in the future, but not guaranteed. It's possible that we bring that experience to different projects, which again have different expectations, and so it's difficult for me to say, well, at least you're going to get this now, but that doesn't change the fact that obviously the entire team really appreciates the founder community and the support, because that really enabled us to just do more in that period, right? And one way or the other, that translates into what everyone does next.
Yeah, and I guess in the short term, hopefully the community will at least appreciate there is an opportunity for potentially a partial refund. That aside, let's perhaps talk more about what actually happened. And I guess the real question is, in your mind, what kind of were the key reasons of why Mavericks failed? And maybe you could fill us in a little bit more on what's actually sort of happened over the last month or so as well.
Yeah, so fundamentally, Mavericks being a game with a team doing work on it, all of whom have worked very hard, and good progress was made. There are a lot of valuable things we've been creating through the experience, through the time of creating Mavericks. So the decision to stop it came down more than anything to expectations, timings, when would be the right thing to see this through. The fact that I stopped the project came down not to the fact that we couldn't necessarily get funding from somewhere in some way, but because it was a very big project with big expectations, and there came a point at which, from the business and from the team, I think that the timing no longer lined up, that there'd been some production issues in terms of, in a way, delivering on some of the easier stuff that you'd expect to be able to deliver for the game. We were solving difficult technical problems, and some of the more nuts and bolts stuff was slipping too much. And so there are always ways to fix these things. When push came to shove over the last month or 2 months ago, I made the decision that it wouldn't be the right option to seek to invest or to obtain more investment capital for the project. And that does not mean that I don't believe in the project, don't still believe in the project, because actually I do. And in fact, I'm sure in future, we'll be able to deliver some great stuff off the back of the work that's done in Mavericks one way or the other. It's that, we had set out with a certain timeline, with certain expectations, and, we weren't matching those expectations. I mean, of course, that we have, experimented and delivered on various kinds of gameplay systems and tech, and that, there was kind of a meandering whereby we'd delivered some interesting stuff, but it wasn't necessarily all aligning, in the way that we'd want. So while there may have been options to continue, with all factors considered, it wasn't the right decision for us to, continue pursuing investment in Mavericks at that time. It's a big project, and I think that we could have de-scoped it, we could have done certain things, but I think the vision of the game and what we set out to do was something massive. And to make something massive, you need to, you really need to look at what you've done and where you are, and understand when something's not working, and when something is working. A lot of the components were working, and so I'm very excited for what we're going to be doing in the future overall. But as a project, it wasn't coming together on time.
Yeah, and so would you say that if you were to sort of order the things that were an issue, would you say that the scope of the project was just too large, and that was kind of the overriding problem with the project?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to convey scope properly with such ambitious projects. It's easy to say something has too big of a scope. At the end of the day, we were obviously, from the beginning, taking on something with a massive scope. So anyone would have told you N years ago that, or right at the beginning of Mavericks, that this was a huge scope and it would be far easier to do something with a smaller scope. I mean, that's obviously been true from the beginning, and it always will be true when you try and do something big and ambitious. There was a big vision, and so the scope was big, and of course, there are options always when you have a big scope project to simply focus on something that makes it achievable. But you need to consider, I think, why you're doing something. When you get into the detail of doing a big project like Mavericks, what experience we're trying to deliver, how are we taking a step forward. Yes, the entire scope was big, and it would have definitely benefited from more focus from the beginning. But I wouldn't really say that scope is at the forefront. You can always navigate big scopes if you have the right way of doing so. The right production methodology, the right tools. And we were building the tools and we were improving our production methodology. But because our tools were experimental, because we needed to improve production, and all these things happened at the same time, those things didn't line up. So I would speak more to really having the right methodology and having the right platform, and and kind of knowing how you're going to approach that big scope, than to necessarily say it has to be smaller. Because I could definitely tell you a million games I could build right now with smaller scopes than Maverick, and do so far more easily. But that really wasn't the point of the project. But you do need to be ready for these big, ambitious games if you're going to try and take them on. And so perhaps it's more the case now that I'm excited. We've actually learned a lot about building that kind of epic game that we wanted Mavericks to be. And I think that we can achieve that, but in a way, even stopping development at the moment is part of a bigger initiative for us to really understand how we can pull off such a big, ambitious, next generation game, and as knowing what will work and what won't work. You have to kind of be able to explore the boundaries. But that's not to say that scope wasn't too big, because it was too big. But I think that you can have a big kind of goal, as long as you have the right path to get there.
So, as part of the scope, that seemed like a key element of it was the concept of having a 1,000 player battle royale.
Yes.
Do you feel that element of the game kind of had a flow-on effect, which meant that the scope ballooned and the technology required also ballooned as well? Just having that element, and also, what was the reason for wanting to have a 1,000 player battle royale? What's the underlying sort of perceived need for it?
I think it's definitely a good point to be made that when you set out so early on to be at this 400 1,000 player mark, when there is so much other stuff to flesh out in the game, when we're trying to drive a much richer experience, why not do that with 50 players and then grow it from there? And that definitely makes a lot of sense and would be a very good way of approaching it. In fact, fundamentally, it was one of the ways we were approaching Mavericks development, because as we were running our playtests, we were fundamentally refining smaller map areas later on and kind of building certain aspects out. Building out is obviously vital to achieving something big in many cases. And so it would have helped in some ways not to necessarily be kind of tied to that expectation, but I don't feel that made too much of a difference. At the end of the day, we were looking to build a rich experience, which involved strategic play between large numbers of people. And so, that needed the technology anyway that lets you have 1,000 players in a game. So I never felt that because we had to build the 1,000 player thing, we now can't develop another feature. It kind of tied in technically so much with the deeper simulation of the world that I don't think it really made too much difference. I think that the communications around it could have been better. I think there's a broader lesson about how we could have communicated and approached the game, aside even from 1,000 players versus something else. But I think the game was always, throughout a lot of its development, yes, it offered 1,000 player battle royale, but we were quite clear that there was a kind of MMO RPG side to it. And I think that even to now, I think that should we release Mavericks, people might play the 1,000 player experience, but be drawn into all the other aspects. I think that made sense all the way through. But I think it's a good general point that you can end up in a way slowed down by trying to achieve one aspect. I think we did have problems like that. I think a bigger example of it through development would have been the way we wanted to approach the game world and the graphics of the game world. Ironically, there were some things we could do to achieve amazing graphics in certain cases, but when you suddenly say you want something rich and have all these photoreal graphics and follow a certain specification, it becomes interdependent, and there's quite a lot of work to do. So I think in a way, within not that I think we needed to lower the quality in globally in a certain way, but I think that if we'd been more careful about the scope of the game world, I think that could have made a bigger difference even than the 1,000 players. So I think it's a good point in general, and I would say it's something that when you approach an ambitious project like Mavericks, you learn in a lot of different areas, from different individual aspects of the design to how you're going to run your playtests and production and how that scales up. I think there's multiple examples of that kind of thing in Mavericks.
Yeah, and I think there's different elements that draw people into a game. For me, it was certainly seeing that teaser trailer, and the high fidelity environment was what drew me in, but I'm sure there were people that probably were drawn in by the 1,000 player battle royale side of things.
Yeah, and with the game world, I think it's interesting where no one's really ever built a many players, high fidelity, rich game world. It's kind of just having everything in a way. And by trying to achieve such an ambitious thing, we did learn a lot of things that you'd be surprised by, which you can actually do, quite easily. Like, there's a lot of technology that's that's available now that we even built in some cases that can do some amazing things and get things high fidelity and scaling. But then there are also things which you'd think would be easy and are difficult, and so through that process we did learn a lot, and I think that we came a long way, but it doesn't always come within the project bound.
Yeah, so just to talk around that technology side of things a little more, the game was being built on CryEngine with SpatialOS involved with it as well. So
yes,
were those two things in the end like the right choice? I mean, would it have been better to choose a different type of game engine? And we have seen, for various reasons, other games that were being built with SpatialOS involved haven't come to fruition as well.
Yes.
Was there an underlying technology problem there?
Well, so, of course, both of those platforms in CryEngine and SpatialOS are kind of, in their core, they support very ambitious games. CryEngine, when they released Crysis, it was a technical marvel compared to what came before. And CryEngine has its benefits to this day of streaming and efficiency, within high definition graphics. There are, of course, alternatives that are great as well. But I think that the way we use that engine and the support we got from that team, it had both great positives and downsides. All technology platforms do. So I wouldn't really say that our choice of engine or choice of networking platform really made a substantial difference. I know obviously there have been other SpatialOS games which have recently stopped development, but I think that comes down to, again, it's an earlier in its development platform which has very ambitious projects on it. Those kinds of projects are more likely to fail, and obviously as things move along and these technologies mature as they are now, you're going to see more projects seen through on those platforms. So on the one hand, yes, there were individual issues with all these pieces of technology as there were with our own, but I wouldn't say that if we'd used a different engine or used a different platform, that we would be more likely to succeed. I think that at the end of the day, Mavericks succeeded at many individual things, including some of the technology we pulled off with both of those partners, and had great successes, some successes which no other game has ever achieved in technical areas. But the reason the project stopped was because of it not coming together, and so you can't really pin that on a platform. That's more of it's more the aggregate of timelines not working out.
Yeah, and sort of along those lines, one thing that seemed to change quite a bit, and I'm guessing must have had some impact on the development of the game, was that the game design itself seemed to flip-flop or change quite a bit. For instance, at one point, the team was talking about having wave drop-ins to the Battle Royale, but then that got dropped. Do you feel that the game design sort of was strong right through, or were there moments when the team were going, actually, I think we're looking at a complete change of what we're doing?
I think that there are really two ways that games can really be developed in this space. You either have a very clear idea of exactly what experience you want to deliver and you deliver that, or you have an idea as to what kind of experience you want, but you're willing to iterate the gameplay and the moment-to-moment experience to get there. Obviously, in reality, it's going to be a combination of both in any game. But to that point, we were very much on the latter. Like, we didn't come into Mavericks saying, this is the exact moment-to-moment experience. Here's how it should be. It's like this other game, but this. We came into Mavericks saying, we are going for a dramatic increase in strategy and immersion. And so there are certain things we know that can help achieve that, but with the gameplay and the way that it balances out and the way that you deploy into the game and the rules and the rule sets, while we're inspired by N different games, the way we're going to approach it is we're going to try a lot of stuff out and try and iterate it quickly. And I think that we're actually quite effective at that in some areas, but because we were simultaneously developing such complicated technology, and I think this in a way answers perhaps a lot of your questions in the most succinct possible way, which is kind of all the right questions that people will be asking right now, which is what was difficult about Mavericks, why did we stop it, why did it fail this year, and I think it comes down to the fact that we were both developing very sophisticated technology and simultaneously trying to use that technology to iterate quickly, and you just cannot do those two things together very easily. We pushed through and got quite far. And, yes, there is an amount of resource and investment that you could perhaps put to that. And in fact, even with the resource we had, if we de-scoped enough, you could see that through. But really, that meant that we weren't hitting the cadence that we wanted, because while the technology was doing great things and the design was coming up with great ideas and iterating them quite quickly, when you interfere the two together, they kind of disturb each other's cadence. You're trying to do too many things at one time because the design requires it. We had some incredible new rendering technology we were working on, but it had to support too many cases in some ways, so it was hard to demonstrate an early version of it, to which point you're kind of not able to really experience what that can deliver. And then vice versa, we have to change the way that the game mode works. We want to achieve a certain thing, but we need to make sure it balances out. We want to make sure that we can deliver a certain experience, but so much engineering resources focused instead on core platform as a small team. And even beyond that, you need to be creating the right platform for the design team to iterate faster. And we had it in certain areas, certain aspects of gunplay and other things. We built some great systems, but on the whole, we didn't get enough of that in. And so I think that's a key learning. And in fact, in terms of what we're doing next, I'm actually running a team now which focuses very much on creating some of this advanced tooling that's going to be needed to do this properly. And as are some of my colleagues from Thompson. So we've recognized that and we've learned that, and we're actually working on trying to empower ourselves for the future and also other games companies to be able to actually benefit from not just cool new technology, but kind of really trying to think about the dev workflow and how we can make sure that we can bring this more sophisticated technology to developers in a way where it's kind of not creating risks in terms of game design trying to be iterated.
So when you talk about doing it properly, are you specifically talking about Mavericks ending up being formed into a game of some type, or are you talking about just games in general?
I'm talking about games in general, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, these learnings kind of apply to a whole space of games. I'm hoping, of course, and expecting that, over the next decade, we'll see a vast increase in the number of complex multiplayer games that can exist. Multiplayer games are actually very difficult to build, at least considered quite difficult to build at the moment, the way they're being approached. And so, I think we're in this kind of border right now where the technology is getting to a place where, more game designs can be explored more easily. In a way, Battle Royale is itself a great example of this, an early example, but a good one, where the kind of seminal tipping point into standalone BR with PUBG, for example, or even to some extent H1 before that, though it came, of course, out of mods, was not that someone suddenly came up with a clever idea, but that suddenly people's graphics cards or Unreal Engine out the box became good enough to do 100 players, and it kind of worked. That these tipping points of technology, which at the moment you can see how they're holding back progress in terms of making compelling games, and there's a whole host more of that to come. And Mavericks really explored all of it, and the technology just wasn't there. Dense. If you look at any one area, some brilliant photoreal graphics achieved by many people in many isolated examples. Fantastic, scaling up in terms of how many players can be supported in games. Far more intricate ways of handling social and player interactions in games. Like, these things all exist in isolation, but they're having to be built bespoke. They're not necessarily being refined and iterated quickly enough because the technology isn't there. So we were having to do all of that for Mavericks, and we just didn't find the path that to us meant that we could continue the project in its current form.
Yeah, and I think for the community, some of the first indications that might have been going on was in the latter part of 2018 when the first playtests for founders were delayed twice. And the reason at the time was that you guys were working on some analytics tools that you needed to be able to run the playtest in a way that was meaningful. Do you feel that kind of was the full reason that we had that delay, or was that problem there as well, and it also meant that you could work on other problems that were kind of in the background that we didn't know about?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of saw this at the time. It wasn't, of course, just the case that the analytics weren't finished in the game. There's plenty of stuff to finish in the game. I think the issues we had around communication at that time came down to the fact that we'd started growing in terms both of us, but also partners and number of people involved in the project, to a point where our messaging wasn't as clear as it really should be. I think we did some follow-up stuff to improve that, but I think what would happen there is it wasn't that we weren't willing to say, hey, this is an early in development game. In fact, I think we made some proactive efforts to do that. It was just quite confusing at that time. We went through a journey of learning, okay, well, now we're bringing on these people and we're trying to communicate differently or between a larger group and a community with more expectations. But instead, kind of communication got watered down, and so it meant that we would say, there'll be an announcement saying, hey, we're delaying this because of, analytics. And it's like, well, I mean, obviously that's not the only reason. Even at the time, I remember like trying to really capture this. But I think as we tried to say in post before that, this was what we're really trying to do here at that time, was say, we're not doing a beta, guys. We're doing like a really early playtest, and so like the reason why we're not necessarily saying, hey, the game's going to be bad is that was kind of the point. It's going to be a bad or not extremely early on in development, but the whole point was we're trying to be prepared to make this really iterate quickly. The idea behind that time of the kind of forge and test and iterate the game was that rather than focus on delivering the best thing we could, crunch it as quickly as possible for an early beta, we would set up a platform. We'd be willing for there to be limited content and things to be very early on, but it wouldn't matter because obviously we would have the right platform and we would iterate content quickly. And the reason that didn't work the way we expected and then looked very strange was because we didn't factor in enough the amount of underlying platform work that needed to be finished before we started the forge. It's that stuff kind of sound strange did make sense. We wanted to release something that was too early, but not in all the areas that it was too early. We were okay for there being one guy, whatever, or three. We were okay for there being some performance issues. We were okay for there being certain things. But we expected the rate of development to be higher of content, and we ended up kind of backlogged on just more core technology. And so that wasn't clear to communicate.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say that probably the community did not have that expectation. I would say largely they probably expected a pretty high fidelity game to be played even in the early stages, and there was kind of a mismatch there. Would you agree?
Yeah, completely. I mean, that was a complete pivot. Our original intention was to deliver a high fidelity world, and in fact, we had higher fidelity content by far than what we released in the Forge, done before the Forge. Even stuff from 6 months earlier was higher fidelity, by not even close. But we chucked. There's something that happened, a number of times as a key line for the project. We were far too willing to throw away things that were kind of working because we were going, look, like, doesn't matter because that's not good enough. Nothing's good enough for our final release. So we were willing to throw everything away to the point where what we had in our playtests was always a fraction of what we actually had. It's not that we secretly had some finished game in the corner, because we didn't, but it was quite ironic that we could be an early stage game and still be subtracting content. And we were conscious of this at the time. But of course, that there was a plan behind it, a logic behind it, and the reason that didn't work out was both, I think, a lack of knowing kind of just how the platform work we were doing would interact with the game development work. The extent to which we'd get certain knock-on effects of the delays of core technology. Despite the fact that actually core technologies was improving and developing quite quickly. It's the amount of requirements created between both. There were just too many unknowns, and obviously, as I said earlier on, it's okay to have something with a lot of unknowns, but you need the right plan to navigate through that space. And that meant that we didn't have the right plan. We were kind of zigzagging far too much.
Yeah. Now, so what would you do if you were starting the whole project again?
I think the better way to approach that question is to talk about the generic lessons, because obviously I could tell you right now, the exact version of Mavericks we could build in X months because we've just done it, and we kind of we've done enough of it now. We weren't that far off launching something pretty reasonable. If all we'd cared about in the world was launching something that was okay, like there were ways for us to do that, right? But that wasn't the promise of what we went for. So if you gave us extra time, and I could tell you the specific learnings, I could give you that answer and just say, well, it would be this, 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 and this. But I don't think that's really the point. I think the point is, if we were approaching a project like Mavericks, something that ambitious, or perhaps the next years of updates worth to Mavericks, then I think the first thing would be, as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's okay to be, I think, ambitious and have a big scope for gameplay, but lock in the core technological requirements. Even though we have a very smart team who are doing a lot of smart tech, you don't want difficult technical problems interfering with your rapid iteration of the game design. So I think, accepting the constraints of this, don't kind of play forward where the technology will be and then add game design. It's really important to be able to see, play, and test what you have, because otherwise you end up in a position where you're not testing, what the experience, and while you might have an idea in your head, that it's just, as soon as there's any delays, that will really compound. But beyond that, I think, you mentioned earlier a bit about this idea of having a clear enough vision of the game design. We were very aggressive with how broad the original game design was, and I think we could have brought in more clarity and experience earlier on. And I think, despite the fact that I made the point of, you don't have to do that, I think that, of course, going forward, I would use that experience and kind of, I feel at this stage, next project we take on, we would look to bring on as much existing experience as we can. We were quite aggressive about innovating in every area. I would instead try and innovate in a small number of areas, and obviously bring experience to the rest. I think there's a balance you can strike there based on experience. I can't say it's 4 things or 5 things. It's just, when you have that experience and you can see what kind of works, when you have a certain size team and a certain scale of project, you can start to get to a feeling for like when you're juggling too much versus when you're actually, kind of able to keep control of the production timelines.
And it would probably also mean that the community would gain confidence in what you were doing if they see that, 2/3 of what you're doing is really solid and there's 1/3 that's clearly experimental. I think that would be absolutely fine with most gaming communities.
No, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, games are all very experimental in what they do, certainly at the moment, or at least the vast majority of multiplayer games are. And of course, the ones that are popular will already have some core that works quite well. And from a background of working on MMORPGs, I know all too well how important it is not to interfere with the core of a game that really works on an existing popular game. So I think that these things are, are clearly, they come up again and again.
Now, there's one thing that I think probably most of the community were a bit puzzled by, which was that we had the first alpha play test at the end of July, and then literally a day or so after it finished, Automaton went into administration. Is there any sort of how do those two things fit together? Because they don't seem to really match very well at all. Was it just a coincidence and you didn't know what was going on, or why did the playtest go ahead?
So the process of administration for the company came on quite quickly. When I made the decision not to pursue options that could continue the project, because I didn't feel like they would be the best overall. They would work out the best overall for the company, and even for what we wanted to achieve with the game. Once that decision had been made, it very quickly meant a process had to begin with administration. And in such a process, both for legal reasons and others, you need to respect the rights of various people, and it becomes a very an important to manage kind of correctly form of process for a business. And so there wasn't too much of a gap between when the alpha playtest had begun and when we first began that. It was perhaps a week or so, but of course we couldn't. Once you begin that process, and even to now, and of course following on from that announcement, there hasn't been a lot of communication from us yet. It's because there is legal process to manage, there are expectations and business matters to deal with, which meant that suddenly we couldn't say too much. And so we've now seen through that process. So it was rapid. It wasn't planned 2 months in advance, that we would do this and say nothing. There was a gap between of a week or so, but of course in that period, the people involved were absolutely, laser focused on making sure that we handled everything the right way, did right by all the people who were both working on the project, involved, got the best outcome possible, and so that's what we were doing. And it meant that for that bit of time, development continued, and I think the alpha playtest was a very good step for the game as well. Some great work was being done. And so the stopping of the project does not mean that I don't believe that it wasn't the case that we could release a game, in November, because there is a game that could be released, but it was a case of, to do what we set out to do, requires significant further investment, and now was not the right time to do that, and so now is the time to reset and look carefully at everything to work out how the best way of creating that game is. And if that ends up being Mavericks in a certain way, then perhaps that will happen. But we are looking very carefully. I'm looking very carefully in what I do next, and a number of the team are through what they're doing next, thinking about absolutely learning all the lessons, working out the right way to approach this kind of project, before we then say, okay, so now we're going to go, whether it be with the same or a similar project of any form. That's why I can't really say a lot now anyway, right? I can't say the answer. What I can tell you is we've learned a lot. Rather than try and scramble that into a release, which was an option, we said, look, we set out to do something huge. We're going to take a step back to make sure that we can achieve that at some point. Not try and aggressively cut scope, or indeed raise money off a promise that we weren't sure exactly when we could deliver. When it became clear that we weren't on track for what we wanted by the end of 2019. I don't mean literally on track, because of course there were many aspirational aspects. I mean, when I felt that the rate of what was in the playtest wasn't lining up with the kind of cadence that matched enough of our expectations, at that point, that's not the time to then double down and raise. It's the time to kind of look at it and then approach it the right way. And so once we decided to do that, it meant that we had to begin the administration process, which is now mostly completed. And so it just meant, of course, as part of that, we found opportunities for the vast majority of the team on other projects. They therefore are no longer on Mavericks, and so there's no one working there, and so communication grinds to a halt very quickly. Of course, now we've seen through the process. I've bought out Mavericks and other properties, and so we will be sure to send out an update and be clear about what our intentions are going forward. At the moment, there is no intention to release Mavericks in the immediate future, though. The learnings are there, the intellectual property is there, and we are definitely committed to doing awesome stuff, in terms of massively multiplayer games and a lot of the ambitions of Maverick. We just can't say yet, or I can't say yet, exactly when that would be, or what form that would take.
So I have a couple of questions out of that. One is, can you tell us where the majority of the team that have found other work have gone to, at least? And the other question I had was, from the IP point of view, if you've bought Mavericks out, do you feel that whatever becomes of that would have to be vastly different? Because I imagine that Mavericks now kind of, the name is tainted as such. But maybe if we can start with talking about where the team are. Can you tell us anything about that?
Of course, part of having of running how to handle when something isn't working out, or when you need to shut something down, and so as part of the process of considering how we were going to stop development on Mavericks. The team was at the center of that, and so the majority of the team. So while the studio closed, it meant that there had to be the team had to find other work. We were aware that there was an opportunity for the vast majority of everyone to transition to another project at one of our partner studios, and across the board, I believe almost, if not everyone from the company is on another project now. So essentially, that doesn't mean that it's Mavericks or exactly the same thing. We've just worked with both our partners and other studios that we know well to make sure that we've found suitable alternative projects for everyone. So of course, in individual cases, they may have made decisions to go to various other projects. For the most part, I think we were able to provide a reasonably seamless transition for the team, and so everyone's working on something that they're experienced in, and we'll be bringing that experience from Mavericks forward. In terms of the intellectual property, I do own the intellectual property now. Of course, that's different to Automaton owning it. Automaton, I think it's important to make the point, never had any equity investment. That would have been a very different proposition. We were a genuine small studio, self-funded. We did have some supportive, kind of project funding that came from one of our partners, but fundamentally there was no equity finance raised. There was no big investment round. There was some stuff reported incorrectly a year or so ago, but the discussions we had early on with some of our early shareholders simply didn't work out, and that wasn't delivered. So we were a company in the end doing a very ambitious project with a very small team and a very small amount of capital. And so it's not that Mavericks stopping has let down a big investor. That would be a very different business. If we'd taken on a significant investment, we would approach a number of things very differently. And so there isn't a big kind of equity investor who's been let down. It was kind of my funding, our team's work that funded, and of course there was some amount of founders pack financing, although of course, as I mentioned, it was relatively a small amount, and we weren't very aggressive. But of course, we understand that because of that, it's the case that we haven't been able to deliver to the customers, to the founders, in the sense of how that would affect what we think about Mavericks going forward in the IP. Mm-hmm. I don't see that as a problem in terms of would we decide to do anything with Mavericks too much, in that it would change how, if we did choose to, and this is entirely theoretical, it's not the case that we have any plans. If we chose to do something with Mavericks, I would feel that I wouldn't approach it in such a way where we suddenly wanted to ask a load of customers for pre-order financing in a way. But if we were to deliver on it, that would perhaps be the best case scenario, because of course we would honor, or I would hope, depending on GDPR and other such things, we would be able to honor the Founders Pack purchases if we did something with the Mavericks brand. And so I think that would work out. So that doesn't really play into a decision as to whether we did Mavericks or not. I think it will come down to just what makes sense. Complete what we set out to do with Mavericks, or to do something like that. That will simply be the discussion. I don't think it needs to be guided by the reputation of Mavericks. I think that's something which can, I think people will understand if in N years' time we did deliver this amazing game, that there were difficulties early on. That's happened on many projects. I don't think that we've asked for enough funding from crowdsourcing and other areas. That wouldn't be a hurdle that we could go over if we did deliver the game. But at the same time, it's more the case that I couldn't say that we would decide that Mavericks was the right game to pursue over a different game.
Yeah, my opinion would be that if you were to ask for any sort of community funding for a game that was called Mavericks, and obviously was Mavericks, probably there would be a large portion of the community that wouldn't be interested in that. I just want to go back one step.
Yeah, of course, that's the point, right? Like I don't think it would be a problem if it was an already completed and delivered experience.
I
but
see
I
what
think
you
it's
mean.
something where, yeah.
So I just want to go back one step. We were talking about the team before. So you can't confirm who they're currently working with because you just sort of said a partner, but can you say who they actually are working with?
The largest portion of the team is working with Improbable, who are obviously our platform partner on the project, and they happen to have their own studios and other operations. They've received a lot of funding and they're doing a lot of stuff. So there happen to be roles for many of the team working within kind of projects there, effectively. And I'm working as part of Improbable as well at the moment on a separate project. It's actually, in that instance, it's not a game project of any form. It's far more kind of what I talked about earlier, about kind of product research, innovation, and trying to make sure we can deliver some of the learning from Mavericks, which are obviously the deep technical learning, and try and deliver that in a way that could help many people in the industry, hopefully. So I'm doing some in that area, but yeah, there are a number of other staff who are working at Improbable, but there are some of our staff who are working at a number of other game studios.
Okay. Well, I think it's good that a good portion of the studio, by the sounds of it, have been able to go on to other work fairly quickly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. This was critical, right? Like, we would. One of the key things to do as running a business is, we need to look after our staff and the people who've made those very significant commitments to the business. So, we absolutely did a number of things to make sure that worked out as best as possible. And I think we got a pretty reasonable result for the team.
Yeah, sounds like it. Now, one other question I had, which isn't related to Mavericks, but Automaton had another project in the pipeline, which was called Project Y. As far as I could tell, it looked like a RPG fantasy style game. Who owns the IP for that, and will that ever see the light of day?
I also own the intellectual property to that game. That was quite an early on project, and so there's really limited that I can say about it. But it does. It was more of a fantasy project. There's some actually very fantastic work that went into that. I'm excited actually for that, and obviously have a background in kind of those kind of fantasy games as well. While that's exciting, I think right now my thoughts are, in a way, one thing at a time.
Yeah.
We're very focused on process right now. I'm hoping to do a number of awesome game projects in the future, but I'm not kind of lining too many up immediately. It's kind of a project which both I think has some very exciting aspects to it, and I'd like to pursue. But at the same time, it's also got learnings that will help in some of the technical and platform work we're doing right immediately. So, in the case of Mavericks and that game, as well as others we've worked on, we're immediately applying learnings from those things to what we're working on right now. But we're not pursuing those games at the moment.
Okay.
Other than Deceit itself is a game which we had released earlier. And does still have a team now maintaining it, and will be doing so going forward. So as an already launched game, that will be looked after, but our in-development games at the moment are not being developed.
And the official sort of press release, I guess you would call it, or information that was put on the Automaton website when the company went into administration was that Deceit would be licensed elsewhere. Has that been the case, or have you brought Deceit as well?
Yes, it was temporarily operated on license, but as of now, I've bought it out, and so there will be a team that is given to pretty imminently that will be able to take it a bit further. Again, I'm now working in another area, but I'm excited for there being a bit more, in a way, resource put on that game, and I'm pretty hopeful they will make some solid updates. That's a game that's, because it's already out. There was a way to get some resource onto that game in order to continue it. But in the case of the other games, they are just kind of in a way sitting there, as part of the many projects and code and assets that we worked on as part of Automaton.
And I would say the Deceit community would be pleased to hear that. And as far as information about what's sort of happened, it's been fairly limited. Like there was the notice put up on the Automaton website. We got a bit of information that I was able to put out through a video, a little bit of information on the Mavericks Discord. Will there be any other updates to what remains of the Mavericks community about what's happening now and in the future?
Yeah, so I'd hope, perhaps even by the time someone's listening to this, that that there have been, some notices and updates put up on Mavericks website and the company website. These things haven't been updated for the last month because of that process that was ongoing. But as of just now, these things have been transferred, ownership's been transferred, and so that means that we can now make the adjustments and clarify things to some extent. There'll be a limited amount of content purely because we are all still focused and working hard on what we're releasing in the future, and to the extent that perhaps there's been some significant missed piece of information or misunderstanding, then we'll step in to clarify that. But I think that the essential notice there will be essentially a very short form version of what we've really discussed in this this interview.
Okay, I think that makes sense, and I think the community will appreciate having a little more info on that in various places. James, is there anything else that you would like to add about what's happened with Mavericks, or anything else that we've discussed?
I think it just really comes down to, relaying again, the team and I really appreciate the support, as we have done for every game we've worked on, the good and the difficult, and of course, in the case of Mavericks, I understand that it's disappointing for everyone. It's disappointing for us. We've had to make this decision. I've had to make this decision that, delivering this game at the end of the year, or in any of the timelines that we've announced, just hasn't been feasible to the quality and the expectations that were set. But we have learned from that, and I think I just want to relay our thanks to the community for their support, because at the end of the day, we did take on a challenging project, and I look forward to still making value out of those lessons and things we've created as part of Mavericks. As I said, we will do whatever we can, and I will do whatever I can going forward to acknowledge all the support that we've gotten. And I think that Mavericks really has made, behind the scenes and in terms of the game development and the work done and the learnings throughout the team, and what we've achieved with our partners, both technically and in terms of the design lessons from the game, will definitely inform things going forward. So there have been some very positive halo effects to Mavericks, and I look forward to continuing to work on on such projects. And we set out to do something huge. We didn't hit it this time, but we've learned a lot, and I look forward to the future.
Yeah, I think if the founders recognised at some point down the track, if Mavericks does end up becoming a game that's released in some form, I think there'd be a portion of the community that would be appreciative of that for sure.
Yeah, of course. If as I said, it's just important to say if there were something done of Mavericks, of course we would recognise to whatever extent we could the founders. But as I say, that's not currently planned. It's not something that we can in any way commit to. Yeah. It's just something that I want to convey that we really appreciate the support, and we'll do what we can to recognise that.
Yep. I understand. All right. Thanks, James Thompson, for taking the time to chat with me. It's much appreciated, and I'm sure the community also appreciate hearing your thoughts about what's happened and what's going to happen going forward.
Cool. No problem.
Okay, so that was James Thompson's views on why Mavericks failed. But what did some of the Automaton developers have to say about it? Well, I've been in touch with two of the development team, let's call them Dev 1 and Dev 2, and their information adds quite a lot of insight into what happened. The following is my paraphrasing of the story that they sent me. On the 30th of July 2019, the team had to arrive into the studio earlier than normal. Once everyone was present, it was announced that Automaton was in debt and therefore going into administration. They were told then that Improbable were making job offers to certain members of the team. Each developer had to wait to be called into a room to find out if they had a job offer or not. Now, Dev 1 described waiting to go into that room as one of the worst feelings they've experienced in a long time. Once each staff member had their verdict, they had to physically leave the studio immediately. After that, the team met at a local pub just down the road. Now, apparently, you could tell as each person arrived at the pub what their employment verdict was just from their body language. Later on, they had an hour or so to return to the office to collect their personal belongings. For most of the team, this was the last time that they set foot in the Automaton studio. As we've already heard from James Thompson, about 2/3 of the studio received job offers from Improbable. And one of the devs described Automaton as the closest group of people they've ever worked with, and that it was heart-wrenching seeing the team get torn apart. They also said that it was a very emotional evening, and some people were on the brink of tears at the thought of not getting to work together again. The first internal rumours of a significant change started to appear around 2 months before it was announced. It was brought up by someone new looking at the project that if they carried on developing the game at their current rate, it simply wouldn't be ready by November, and it certainly wouldn't be a success. It was unclear what change to the development process was required, but at one point apparently they considered completely switching to using the Unreal 4 engine to build the game instead of CryEngine. Then a few weeks before the 30th, there was a rumour that Improbable were going to acquire Automaton. The details of this proposal were pretty vague, but it was likely that Automaton would operate as an Improbable studio and that they would carry on developing Mavericks in Unreal 4. At this stage, the general understanding was that about 90% of the studio, basically the entire dev team, would be kept on. Around 3 days before Automaton shut down, it was rumoured that Improbable were going to acquire Automaton, but not in the way they expected. Although Automaton's first title, Deceit, had turned a profit, it was released when the studio was around half its size. Now, if the studio had stayed around that size, it could have easily kept itself afloat. However, to take on Mavericks, it had grown to over 30 people, including quite a few seniors, so the payroll at this point was probably pretty big. The studio was pretty much relying solely on Improbable's money at this point, and as there were other projects on the go, like Project Y, that had nothing to do with Improbable. Improbable's point of view was that it made more sense to pull their investment and then handpick members of the team to work for them instead. Firstly, the scope of the project. The development team working on Mavericks was much smaller than it may have appeared. When they started developing Mavericks, they had just released their first title, Deceit, with a very small team of less than 20 people, which only included 3 programmers. The plan for Automaton back then was to create a fantasy MMORPG as their main project. Now, I'm guessing that's Project Y. Several artists were hired specifically for that project, but in the time between their interviews and when they started, which was in mid-2017, the plan had completely changed. Player numbers in PUBG were soaring, and the idea came about to make a Battle Royale shooter as a medium-sized project to also help develop tech that they were going to need for the fantasy MMO. Now, the earliest version of Mavericks game design was actually a complete clone of PUBG, but they constantly struggled to come up with ways to rejuvenate the classic Battle Royale formula, and so the scope of Mavericks ballooned in size in order to offer something unique, which was really the biggest hurdle that they faced. When they read through the original game design document, many of the team were concerned about the amount of content in there. The game would feature a gigantic map, vehicles, highly detailed destruction that would persist across the world, dynamic wildlife, a character customization system, interactive NPCs, a sprawling social hub and auction houses for skins and loot, with an entire economy built around it. pretty much everyone in the dev team apparently at that point thought there's no way that we can make all of this. They also had the task of not only creating a gigantic map, but populating it with as much detail as they had shown in their early teaser trailer. This was manageable when working in a smaller area, and they had a small island around the time of the GDC conference in 2018 that looked absolutely beautiful. So Dev1 says that their original promo material, like the teaser shown here, wasn't misleading in terms of the level of detail that they could achieve, but the hard part was transferring that to a map that was 10 times the size. They simply didn't have the resources to do this effectively, especially as their environment team had a lot of trouble retaining staff. They had people leave who were fed up, and other people were let go as well. This meant that for the final few months of development, they only had 2 environment artists. An area like the train yard, for instance, took months to make, and that's only one tiny area of the map. Dev1 also says that game design was constantly an issue in the eyes of the majority of the team. The question of why is more players more fun could never really be answered that well, and you can kind of see this at the 2018 E3 presentation. Let's watch that.
James, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, I want to immediately ask, what about Mavericks Proving Grounds distinguishes itself from other Battle Royale games?
Yeah, well, as you said, it's a very popular formula, and that last man standing kind of game type is incredibly compelling by itself. But Mavericks is really about depth. We've already talked about 400 players before, and we're sort of super excited today to talk about our 5-man squad mode being 1,000 players. But really, it's about depth as well. It's about the fact that that environment is even a bigger step, the simulation and those elements sort of combining together.
Dev1 says that they still squirm watching that presentation, and that they guess it was assumed that more players equaled more chaos, therefore more fun. But they had no way of testing that theory with a high player count until the game was live. They didn't have bots or anything like that to use. So the perceived or real need to innovate the classic Battle Royale formula led to the game's design being constantly changed, with ideas like having multiple waves of players enter the area and being able to bring in guns with you. By the time they started the alpha playtest, just before Automaton went into administration, the game design had been through so many iterations that they actually ended up with the bizarre case of players queuing up to enter the exploration mode. They remember seeing screenshots of players queuing for the drop pool to open. For a game that was supposed to be about having a high player count, they were absolutely baffled at how they had gotten to that point. They also had problems with the production side of the team. Although their production department was experienced, ideas apparently were being shut down or deviated by management, leading to a lot of frustration. One of the producers actually had to take leave for quite a few weeks to deal with the stress, and none of the team seemed to know if or when they were coming back. Some of the issues also came from using CryEngine. The problem was that the version they were using was completely different from the one that is used on recent CryEngine releases, for instance Hunt Showdown, which has been praised for its visuals and tech. When it came to developing Mavericks, they took a CryEngine version that was almost a blank canvas of an engine. This meant that almost every feature in the game had to be implemented by the tech team, creating a massive bottleneck in development. By the end of development on Mavericks, they had a tech team of 6 people, and out of that team, only 4 of them were assigned to implementing gameplay features, as a couple of them specialized in certain areas like rendering. Bear in mind, this team was also responsible for fixing game-breaking bugs and crashes on top of development features. Apparently, almost every feature they added to the game went down to the wire and was finished literally a day or so before a patch release. This left no time for polishing or testing. For instance, the interactive in-game train in the train yard became a studio meme, as they had a single programmer working over the weekend to add it, but even then they had cases of it jittering around or even flying up into the sky. All of this was compounded by some of the early interviews with media giving the impression that the game was much further down the line than it actually was. The devs also felt that their media releases were misleading around SpatialOS. This wasn't a complaint about SpatialOS itself, as they think it's a great tool, but in early dev diaries it was said that SpatialOS would empower the team to deliver much more fidelity to the game, including destruction, wildlife, and persistence across the world, where everything such as destroyed buildings would appear exactly the same to all players. In theory, this is all true, but for a team of their size, it was beginning to sound a bit like a magic wand that you could wave at a game and make it jump a generation ahead. SpatialOS also doesn't have anything to do with rendering the visuals. You could have every blade of grass in the map as an individual spatial entity if you wanted to, but they would still have to be rendered on the client side. Therefore, the game needed optimizing in the same way as any other game. This is another reason why the map didn't feature vegetation and lighting in the same level of detail as the early teaser trailer video. In addition, Dev 2 felt that James had the tendency to change things at the very last second, for instance adding last-minute new ideas, and that these often caused issues with the development process. They also felt that his lack of communication with the marketing and community team prevented them from doing their job effectively, because he would sometimes mention game elements on the Mavericks Discord, and some of those times that was the first instance anyone in the entire studio had heard of them. The scope of the game never really changed. Instead, they pretty much just ignored features like vehicles, destruction, and wildlife, as they knew that they would never get done. On the other hand, they were still building the massive Isle of Dern and social hub right up until the last day. They attempted to help the environment side of things by outsourcing some of the asset creation. Now, I'll outline some info I've uncovered about this later, but most likely this was done by Virtuous, who have been previously involved in the development of a whole suite of AAA games. However, even with their help, the dev team still needed environment artists in-house to implement it, and the environment on the whole was never on track to be completed. On the engine side, as mentioned earlier, there were rumours about changing from CryEngine to Unreal 4, but at this point they were already running out of time. Dev 1 thinks that they probably should have used Unreal 4 from the beginning. The Mavericks community was told that the delays were caused by Automaton's need to upgrade their analytics system. This may have been true, however, Mavericks had also just gone through the biggest change in its history, the switch from third person to first person. Now, this might seem like a straightforward change, but it meant a significant amount of work needed to be done. First off, the gun models were originally made for a third person shooter, so the level of detail was nowhere near high enough for an FPS, so they needed to be redone. Also, all of the guns needed new animations. This included movement, firing, draws and stows, and a full set of reloads. Changing to first person also means you have to completely rework the character controller and gunplay. Originally, the game was to be something along the lines of a third-person PUBG, as you can see from this early footage. But what they ended up aiming for was a first-person shooter to rival Battlefield, which is a huge undertaking. Dev 1 thinks that the switch to first-person was a good decision, and the game was more fun for it, but it just meant a lot of work. Now, this was all going on in the summer of 2018, and they only had 1 or 2 guns which would be ready on time, the AKM and possibly the USP. They also had some major problems with the main character model. All of the internal playtests in August 2018 featured lots of bald men in boxer shorts running around punching each other. This did get improved, of course, but overall the look and feel of the game wasn't great, and it was also riddled with bugs. All of this meant that the game would simply not be ready by the end of August 2018. So, while the delay to work on analytics tools was definitely true, there were also major issues with where the game was at in development, and that meant that they actually had to change the entire development timeline because of the core platform work that was still required. It was a major change from what their early marketing had told players, and it was very difficult for them to explain that change, and likewise very difficult for the community to accept it. A lot of the devs felt that they should have used the Unreal Engine from the very beginning. This would have taken a load off the tech team and put power in the hands of the designers and artists. It also would have been easier to prototype new features. Although to achieve a game with 1,000 players, they would still have needed a tech team of probably 5 times the size of what they actually had. Now, building a game which hosts 1,000 players inherently means you need a large scale and a large map, which were two of the biggest hurdles they had to overcome. Dev1 says that they would have preferred it if they had kept the scale small to start with and focused on making the core game loop fun. Once they had their work pipeline nailed down, they could have expanded from there. Instead, they started off by trying to make the biggest of everything. In an ideal world, Mavericks could have stood out from other shooters a bit more if they had pursued the lore and factions in more depth. The factions didn't really play any part in the Mavericks alpha, but early on there were ideas of having a hub for each faction with NPCs giving out quests and contracts. Some of the concept art for that was pretty amazing as well. Each faction would have had their own agenda, and the results of large-scale battles would determine the fate of the Isle of Dern. This would have required a much bigger team, but a lot of people working at Automaton were into story-driven games, and they all agreed that this would make the game much more interesting. Indie games have been a big part of the gaming industry for quite some time now, and it's very hard to calculate how long a game will take to develop, and unless you have a big publisher, it's also hard to get an investment up front that will cover your entire development cost. That's why most indie developers need a way of raising money to fund development earlier on. In a lot of cases, this can work out well for everyone and you get a great game at the end of it. In other cases, people never even get the chance to play a game that they've paid for. In the case of Mavericks, there was a long way to go to achieve what they set out to. But on the other hand, founders also got to play the game alongside the development team and give their feedback. Dev1 regrets that as a team they couldn't offer more, but also wants to dispel this idea that the founders' money is now in the dev team's pockets. The fact is, the company went into administration from being in debt. That money was purely to help the studio develop the game that the community believed in as they did. Dev1's exact words were, "Every single person I worked with at Automaton has a passion for making games, and we're as disappointed as you are that the game never reached its full potential. But thanks for being part of it, and I wish I could sign off with, see you on the proving grounds." Okay, that's all the information that I have from James and the devs, but before I summarise things, I want to mention some publicly available info about the financial status of Automaton, which I've uncovered. And within that, there are 3 things which I think are worth mentioning here. Firstly, Mavericks' principal investors were RSBuddy, which is a company that James Thompson owns, and Improbable, who make the SpatialOS software. Both companies invested around £1.3 million, or about $1.6 million US into Mavericks, although Improbable may have recovered a portion of their investment following Automaton going into administration, as other documents appear to show that they were a secured creditor. So my understanding from the documents is that James Thompson by far has lost the most money in the project's failure. Additionally, a sum of around £82,000 was owed to Virtuous, which almost certainly confirms that they were the third party that was called on to try and complete some of the environmental art that the game required. Okay, let's summarise things. After listening to what James had to say and reading what the devs wrote, I think the most succinct explanation for the failure of Mavericks Proving Grounds is that Automaton had too little capital to both develop the new tech required for the game, as well as then using that new tech to quickly develop a game with such a vast scope. In other words, they simply bit off more than they could chew. In addition, James Thompson, as the studio's CEO, alongside the producers, probably lacked the experience required to lead the team out of that situation successfully. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that negatively towards James or the producers. I'm just stating that having more experience in the production side of things could have resulted in an appropriate downscaling of what was trying to be achieved at a stage of development that could have allowed a version of Mavericks to be developed successfully. For instance, even a 20-player game similar to PUBG, on a much smaller map with high fidelity that added some interesting new innovations like fire propagation and persistent destruction, and that also had a strong faction element and lore, might have been successful. However, as James said, that wasn't what they were trying to achieve. When it comes down to it, the success of any business ultimately falls on the shoulders of the CEO. James Thompson is only 25. That by no means says that he can't successfully lead a studio in developing a great game. In fact, I believe that will happen at some point in years to come. However, sometimes inexperience results in the inability to pick up on overarching problems before it's too late. But I do think that James really did acknowledge that in the interview. Now that he's working at Improbable, I hope James has good mentors and leaders above him so he can continue to add to his experience from the failure of Mavericks. In addition, I'm pleased for those Automaton staff who are now working for Improbable. From what I hear, it's a great environment to be in, with lots of experienced team members. I feel, though, for the developers who are out of a job. They're the ones who have suffered the most in some ways. I wish them all the best with whatever comes next. Lastly, what about us, the players? I'm really pleased that founders can currently get most of their money back through a refund. I wasn't expecting that, and it's a positive outcome for us. What about the lessons, though? Well, for me, I know when it comes to following and backing new games, the Mavericks experience will force me to take a closer look at the experience of any dev team and its leaders, and also at the scope of what they're trying to achieve, and to see whether those two things fit together, and also to ask harder questions along the way. Will that be the same for you? Let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.
It's just the night in